Hello, I am really sorry. I know that a lot of you are experiencing some issues, even us actually. There's a little bit of a delay for some and not for others. So I just cross all my fingers and hope that most of you can hear and benefit from this session. I wanted to now introduce you to Christine and Lauren, who will be having a conversation. So Christine is the clinical lead for genetic counseling. Yes. Sorry, because I see the slides, are not for the next session. So we're just having a conversation right now. So with Christine, thank you for joining us, Christine, from Genomics in Lauren on the phone and maybe on video, that's less sure. And Lauren is the director of support for SWAN UK, so the support group for undiagnosed patients at Genetic Alliance UK.
Hello, everybody. It seems as if there is a delay. So I'm going to be talking very slowly, I think. Lauren, can you hear me?
Hi, Chris. Yeah, I can. It is quite slow and there's a delay. So I feel like we're talking to each other from different dimensions.
Okay, let me just...
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, that's a start.
Okay, so my question, in your experience with patients and families that are at a variety of stages in their journeys from undiagnosed to diagnosed, what do they say is important for them?
I think it's interesting to see how the priorities for families change as time goes on. And so in the early days, it's very much all hinged on just needing that diagnosis, especially if their child is medically unwell or if there's questions about whether they're going to survive. And so it's just, they just need that diagnosis. They need to know the cause. I think the interesting shift you see as time goes on is actually their sense of what a diagnosis is changes. So in the early days, it's that answer of what's happened and why has this happened. But actually, and you see this with families that do get a diagnosis of a very rare condition, really what they're looking for is prognosis. They're looking for a sense of what the future might hold. They're looking for answers about what will happen if they have more children. So really, to the sense of being undiagnosed to a family, I think, is quite different to what the clinical understanding of it can be. We have many families that will get a diagnosis of a rare condition. You know, they'll know the cause of their child's difficulties, but in the same breath as telling us the single gene disorder name, they'll also tell us they're still undiagnosed. And it's because emotionally they still don't have any of the answers to the questions that they're seeking.
So that emotional context is a big part of the journey for them?
Absolutely. I think it's probably the key part of the journey, really, and I think it's the most important thing to keep in mind when working with families. So it's very to get excited by the advancements in genomics, but as Olaf just mentioned, you know, there's still 50% of patients with rare disease who haven't got answers. There's still 15 million families waiting. And so I think it's really important when you're talking to them about the advancements and the new opportunities for diagnosis, we don't forget just how emotionally draining this is for them as well.
And in your experience, and this is my experience as in clinical practice, is there's this wonderful excitement about the diagnosis, a wonderful scientific endeavour. Of course, it is a very important step on the journey, but it's also just another point of transition on this journey. And I'm just wondering how we can perhaps help support families through this.
I think that's absolutely key, and I think it's really important to always bear in mind that the diagnosis isn't the end of the story for the family. It is, as you said, a transition to the next stage. We've been doing some work, as you know, because you were involved on the Solve RD project, talking to families about how can we make this easier for them and what do they really want. And the key message that came both from the UK and the Czech Republic was about follow-up, that families need to have that initial appointment, and then there needs to be another follow-up appointment and more opportunities to engage post-diagnosis to help them move into this new phase and understand what that means.
Yes. And I also think it's really important to remember that because there isn't a diagnosis doesn't mean that the family doesn't have a problem. There is a diagnosis to be made, so the family and patient still has medical needs, still has psychological needs, still has treatment needs, and we mustn't forget that.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we've always pushed since sort of starting up the work through SWAN UK and then the kind of wider SWAN Europe Alliance is about this isn't just a kind of temporary stage and everything starts at diagnosis, but actually there's a need to recognise the undiagnosed community almost in the same way as we recognise a condition-specific group, that they do have a distinct set of needs and we need to respond to them and meet them. And we would like to see that there is actually better kind of tracking of how many patients are undiagnosed, which is why the work that's happening through Solve RD is so exciting for us, because it's the first time we've really seen the attention at this early stage rather than everything sort of being on the moment of diagnosis.
Yeah, and as the audience can see, I'm not young, and so started in genetics over 30 years ago when we had very few diagnoses made. We had very few diagnostic tools. And of course, the amazing progress since then is wonderful. But we've also lost something, I think, in our care of families, where we just did the best with what we had. And we talked about what it meant, and we talked about familial choices, and we could do very little. So we've moved on a long way. But we also need not to forget the needs of patients. Just because you don't have a diagnosis doesn't mean you don't have a condition.
And do you think, Chris, that now there is greater expectation of a diagnosis? So almost now families are led to believe they'll get a diagnosis and it's a really big shock when it doesn't come. I often get asked when we talk to clinicians and they say, well, when should we tell families about you? Because if we tell you at the start, we're implying we might not get a diagnosis and we don't want to do that and worry them. And I always think that that's a bit disingenuous because we know that it's just as likely that they might not. So I wonder what your opinion is on that.
The reality is that even today, as Holmes said, with all the technology we can throw at this problem, there is a 50-50 chance of getting the genetic diagnosis anyway. And so I think we're obliged to be honest and transparent. And I suppose after that first search has been done, is to then put families in touch with you, I think, or in touch with similar patient organisations across the world.
Yeah, because that's the thing we find is that often families aren't told early, and then later on it's just sort of assumed that they've already found us. And so actually they can go for years and years without support.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the work that SWAN has done in the UK has been amazing. And I know there are families that do get one of these diagnoses, a very rare gene variant, gene fault, and they're perhaps only one of a handful of families in the world, or they're not typical. They join the patient support group, and of course they're not typical of the condition because they've not had an easy diagnosis made. And I know they get back in touch with you.
They do, yeah. In fact, we found that a lot just weren't sort of leaving straight away because they didn't really have anywhere to go. And this again is that sense of, I was talking earlier about the kind of emotional feeling of being undiagnosed. And there are some families, they may get a diagnosis, they might go off for a while and kind of find their new club, but if something happens that suddenly makes the future seem unsure again and they don't know what's happening, often they'll kind of bounce back to us again and they'll turn up again, or sometimes after a couple of years. And it's almost as if they're back in that state of just not having a sense of what the world holds for their child. And so that they kind of revert back to feeling undiagnosed again because it's all of the same emotional triggers.
Yes, I agree. And I think we could talk, as always, for hours, but I think we need to wind up now and go to the next speaker. So thank you. I'm going to thank you and look forward to hearing
Thank you too.
the next speaker. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.